"Pick that up, sweetheart." Those words hung in the fluorescent-lit cafeteria like smoke, and the laughter that followed, low, satisfied, the kind that came from knowing you held absolute institutional power, belonged to Dr. Marcus Caldwell, Chief of Critical Care at St. Michael's in Savannah. He stood over the scattered remnants of a lunch tray, smirking down at a woman on her knees gathering papers across cold tile, his posture the casual confidence of a man who had never once had to apologize for anything. The night shift nurse cleaning up his mess was Megan O'Brien. She had been invisible for 20 years, and it was precisely the kind of invisibility that saved lives. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they always did, that particular frequency that made the back of your teeth ache if you paid attention to it. St. Michael's was a teaching hospital, 300 beds, trauma center, the kind of place where young doctors learned to operate under pressure and nurses became the actual architects of survival. The corridors smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee and something underneath it all, something organic and metallic that nobody talked about. Megan moved through those corridors during the 2200 to 0600 watch with the efficiency of someone who had been trained by institutions far older and more demanding than any civilian hospital. She wore scrubs like armor. Simple blue, unremarkable, the kind that blended into the background of any ICU. Her badge clipped to her chest read "Them the Brian, RN" with a photograph that could have matched anyone, brown eyes, no distinctive features, hair pulled back with military precision. What the badge did not show was that her hands had held a 6-year-old's chest cavity open in the rubble of a bombed marketplace in Ramadi while her ears rang from overhead fire. What it did not show was that 20 years ago, the Pentagon had decided she did not exist. The reason was classified. The details were buried. The records were erased. Megan had made peace with that a long time ago. She arrived for her shift at 2,147 hours, 43 minutes before the night crew took over the ICU. Early, always early, the kind of punctuality that the younger nurses thought was obsessive and the older ones recognized as military habit. The unit was still loud with day shift, voices overlapping, monitors beeping their constant surveillance song, the whoosh of the automatic doors as residents moved between patient rooms carrying charts and coffee cups and the weight of decisions that people at home had no idea they were making. She clocked in at the nursing station, a curved counter of worn formica where a half-dozen nurses were engaged in the handoff ritual, transferring information about 18 critically ill patients like priests passing sacred texts. "O'Brien, you've got beds 4, 7, and 11 tonight," said Janet, the day-charge nurse, a woman who had been running this unit for 14 years and had the exhausted eyes to prove it. 4's post-op abdominal from this morning, stable but still on a propofol drip. 7's a septic pneumonia, cultures pending. 11's your admission from the ED, MVA with a closed head injury, slight edema on the CT but neuro checks every hour. Megan nodded once. She did not take notes. She did not need to. 3 patients, 18 medications, 42 data points, 12 potential complications. The information organized itself inside her brain in the same way it had organized itself in the field hospital in Ramadi, the same way it had during the 2 deployments after that, the same way it had for the entire 20 years since she had chosen to disappear. "Anything I should watch for?" she asked. "For might extubate tonight. Your call whether to keep him sedated or start the wean. 7's got a wife who talks to him constantly, she's sweet but she asks about every lab value. And 11's family is in the waiting room, looking terrified. First time in a hospital, I think." Megan absorbed this information. The effective landscape of the shift. The family dynamics. The subtle cues about which patients would require emotional labor versus technical precision. This was the part of nursing that doctors did not understand, the part that hospital administrators measured in patient satisfaction surveys that meant nothing. This was the part that actually kept people alive. She changed into her shift scrubs and made rounds, checking each patient in sequence. Bed 4, the post-op, his breathing steady and even, oxygen saturation at 96%, for lines patent and clear. She verified the pump settings on his sedation, propofol at 40 micrograms per kilogram per minute, the dose documented in his chart, the fluids running at 75 milliliters per hour. Everything was correct. Everything was organized. Everything was the kind of perfect that came from 2 decades of understanding that chaos killed people. In bed 7, the pneumonia patient, she spent for minutes simply listening to his lungs with her stethoscope, hearing the crackle deep in his bases that indicated fluid accumulation, understanding from the sound alone that his condition was deteriorating even though his oxygen saturation looked acceptable. She made a note to check his cultures early, to alert the resident if his white count was climbing faster than predicted. Bed 11 was the admission. Young guy, maybe 30, motorcycle accident 3 hours ago. His head was bandaged, his left arm in a temporary splint, and his eyes had that particular quality of fear that came from not yet understanding how bad the injury was. His mother sat beside his bed in a plastic chair that had probably cost the hospital $40 in 1998, and she was holding his hand. "He's going to be okay?" the mother asked. Megan's voice, when she spoke, was quiet and even. Professional. Deferential in the way that civilian nurses learn to be. "We're watching him closely. The scans look good so far. If you see any changes, if he seems confused, if he's more sleepy, if anything feels different, you ring me immediately." "Okay," the mother said, and some of the tension left her shoulders. Not all of it. Some things did not leave your shoulders for weeks, and sometimes months, and sometimes forever. Megan worked through the night in the way she had trained herself to work, with complete attention to 4 metrics: oxygenation, perfusion, pain, and protection. Every decision flowed from those 4 data points. Every medication, every fluid adjustment, every subtle shift in positioning was intended to optimize one of those 4 functions. By 0400 hours, all 3 of her patients were stable. 4 was beginning to wake, and she noted the changes in his anesthesia plan. 7's wife had finally fallen asleep in the waiting room. 11's neuro checks remained stable. It was at morning rounds when she asked the question that would change everything. Dr. Caldwell was making his way through the ICU at 0638, flanked by 2 junior residents and a medical student, the kind of entourage that physicians carried to make themselves feel important. He was tall, expensive-looking in the way that money purchased through inherited wealth always was. His watch was an Omega, his shoes were Italian leather, his tie was silk. He had red wine in him from the night before. You could smell it under his cologne, that particular sourness that came from expensive restaurants and conversations about things that did not matter. "Bed 4 is responding well to sedation withdrawal," one of the residents offered. "Vitals stable, trending toward extubation." Caldwell nodded, not actually listening. He was looking at the supply cart in the corner of the unit, specifically at the inventory tags that Megan had been reviewing during the quiet hours of the night shift. "Doctor," she said. Her voice was steady. Not deferent enough to be afraid, not confident enough to be challenging. A nurse asking a doctor a question, which was the standard power dynamic in hospitals everywhere. "Can I ask you about the supply ordering for the past 2 months?" Caldwell's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. Sharpened. The look of a predator who had just detected movement in tall grass. "What about it?" he asked. "The equipment requisitions seem inconsistent with patient volume. We're ordering level 1 rapid infusers at twice the rate we're using them, and the ventilator consumables are documented as 34 units per month, but I count using maybe 16 consistently." The residents exchanged glances. Questioning supply ordering was not typically the domain of a night shift nurse. It was not typically the domain of anyone except the procurement committee and hospital administration. "That's above your pay grade," Caldwell said. His smile did not reach his eyes. "We order conservatively. It's better to have supplies than to run short." "Of course, doctor. I was just reviewing the patterns." She had made a mistake. A tactical error. 20 years of invisibility had taught her to keep her head down, to perform her duties with excellence and silence, to never draw attention from anyone in a position of power. And she had just done exactly that, because she had noticed something that a civilian nurse would not have noticed, the mathematical precision that indicated deliberate inflation of orders, the kind of systematic overcharging that suggested a relationship between the purchasing department and a vendor that benefited from higher volumes. It was exactly the kind of thing that had gotten people killed in field operations. Corruption. Graft. The kind of rot that started small and spread until entire systems failed. Caldwell moved on with his rounds, but his attention had locked onto her. She could feel it, the weight of his focus, the way his mind was calculating something about who she was and what she represented. That was when she first touched the challenge coin in her pocket. It was a habit from 20 years ago, the kind of unconscious motion that soldiers made when they needed to verify something was real. The coin was tarnished silver, worn smooth from handling, and engraved on one side was her unit designation and on the other side was a single word, Valkyrie. Her call sign from Ramadi. The only proof that she had ever been anything other than a nurse. She did not intend to touch it. But her fingers moved there anyway, confirming its presence, confirming that somewhere underneath the blue scrubs and the civilian life and the invisibility, she was still who she had always been. By 0700, when the day shift arrived, Caldwell had already moved on with his day. Or he appeared to have moved on. He was in the cafeteria at 1130 hours, which was unusual for a chief of service who typically ate at his office or skipped meals entirely, surrounded by a crowd that screamed opportunity to him. He was laughing about something, gesturing broadly, the kind of performance that physicians with inherited wealth did for audiences of younger doctors who still had to work for their positions. Two residents sat across from him, Chen and Patel, first-year fellows, the kind of ambitious young physicians who had never known what it was like to genuinely earn anything because the system had been designed for their success since birth. "I'll give her a week," Caldwell said. His voice carried across the cafeteria with the confidence of someone who never worried about being overheard. The new night shift nurse. O'Brien. She's got that nervous energy, that type who asks too many questions. They always quit when they realize they're in over their head. "Bet you 500 she makes it to 2 weeks, Chen said. Caldwell smiled. "She won't. But sure. 2 weeks from tonight." Megan was in the serving line, tray in hand, deliberately not listening to a conversation that was very much intended for her to overhear. Humiliation required an audience. Power required witnesses. Caldwell was establishing the narrative in advance of what he clearly intended to be her termination, creating documentation through the form of gossip that would insulate him from any charge of unfairness. She continued down the line. Salad. A sandwich. Fruit. Her movements were measured and controlled, the kind of efficiency that left no room for emotion. When she turned to find a table, Caldwell was directly in her path. "Excuse me," she said quietly. He did not move. Instead, his foot extended slightly, a deliberate obstruction, the kind of thing that could have been accidental if anyone had been looking. His tray connected with her arm, a gesture that might have been clumsy, might have been a genuine accident. Except it was not. The tray went down. Coffee spread across the tile in a dark stain. The salad box burst open, letters scattering like confetti. Her sandwich tumbled across the floor. And her charts, the notes she had brought to review during her break, the documentation of her observations about supply ordering, scattered across the cold tile in a dozen different directions. The cafeteria went quiet. Every head turned. Every conversation paused mid-sentence. The energy of the room shifted, everyone suddenly aware that something significant was occurring, that power was being demonstrated, that hierarchy was being established. Caldwell stood above her, still holding his tray. He did not apologize. He did not offer to help. Instead, he smiled, the kind of expression that came from complete confidence in his own impunity. "Pick that up, sweetheart." The words were loud enough for the entire cafeteria to hear. The laughter came almost immediately, the nervous laughter of subordinates witnessing a display of power, the released tension of people who understood they were observing a ritual of dominance. Megan knelt. She did not hesitate. She did not flush. Her jaw tightened, the only visible reaction, the merest compression of the muscles along her mandible. But her hands did not shake as she gathered the scattered papers. The charts. The evidence of her observations. She picked them up one by one, placing them carefully back into her folder, her movements deliberate and controlled. Her composure was absolute. She picked up the salad, the sandwich, the broken coffee cup. She worked methodically, completing the task with the same efficiency that defined her nursing: no wasted motion, no emotional leakage, just the execution of what needed to be done. Around her, the laughter continued. Someone made a joke. Someone else made a comment about knowing her place. The sounds of the cafeteria gradually returned to normal, the ritual complete. When she stood, Caldwell was gone. He had moved on with his day, having successfully established the beginning of his narrative. The bet was placed. The narrative was established. The witnesses had seen her humiliation. It was only in the quiet of the supply closet, 3 minutes later, that her breathing deepened. Not from distress. From the particular kind of controlled anger that came from understanding exactly what was happening and being completely certain about what the appropriate response was. She reached into her pocket and closed her fingers around the challenge coin. The metal was warm from her body, worn smooth from 2 decades of habit. On one side was the unit designation. On the other side was the word Valkyrie. The tarnished silver felt like a promise. The morning inventory audit started like every other one: spreadsheets, equipment logs, the quiet click of her ballpoint pen as Megan moved through the supply room on the 3rd floor. It was 6:56 a.m., the hospital still wrapped in that grey pre-dawn silence where mistakes lived in plain sight. She had been at St. Michael's for 3 weeks now, and the numbers didn't add up. Equipment requisitions for the ICU were inflated by roughly 30%, orders placed for supplies that never arrived, vendor invoices that corresponded to no actual deliveries. The pattern was too clean, too consistent. Not sloppy. Intentional. She documented everything in her small, precise handwriting. Quantities. Dates. Vendor names. A spreadsheet that told a story if you knew how to read it. The kind of reading she had learned 20 years ago, analyzing intelligence briefs in a forward operating base where one detail could mean the difference between an extraction and a body bag. This was the same skill, just applied to a hospital supply closet instead of classified operations. By 7:15 a.m., she had enough. She walked to Dr. Caldwell's office on the 4th floor, the folder tucked under her arm, her scrub still fresh from the laundry, her badge displaying nothing but her name and RN credentials. She knocked on his door, the firm, professional, the knock of someone with a legitimate question. Caldwell was at his desk reviewing patient charts, his posture the kind of relaxed that comes with knowing no one questions you. He was in his mid-40s, the sort of handsome that required a $400 haircut and a Rolex to maintain, his white coat perfectly pressed, his stethoscope draped around his neck like theater costume. He looked up, and Megan watched his expression shift, first irritation at the interruption, then something colder when he registered who was standing in his doorway. "Dr. Caldwell, I have a question about the supply orders for the ICU." He didn't invite her to sit. He didn't close the door. He leaned back in his chair, and the faintest smile crossed his face, the expression of someone who had just identified a problem and was already calculating how to eliminate it. "The supply orders," he repeated, his voice carrying that particular inflection doctors use when speaking to people they don't consider peers. "The requisitions for the last 6 weeks show equipment quantities that don't match actual inventory consumption," Megan said. She opened the folder, placed it on his desk. "There's a pattern. Anesthesia carts, level 1 infusers, defibrillators, all ordered in numbers that exceed documented usage by approximately 30%. Caldwell didn't look at the folder. He looked at her. His eyes moved across her face, assessing, calculating. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. "You've been here 3 weeks. "Yes, sir. And in 3 weeks, you've decided to audit my department's procurement practices. I noticed inconsistencies." He stood up, moved to the window. His office overlooked the city, Savannah spreading out below them in the humid morning light, Spanish moss hanging from oak trees like the ghosts of better decisions. When he turned back to face her, his expression had settled into something Megan recognized. The expression of a man preparing to change the rules. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice conversational, almost friendly. Effective immediately, you're being transferred to the night shift. Graveyard. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. And you're being removed from any access to supply requisition forms or inventory systems. Sir, I just wanted to clarify. You're not management. You're not administration. You're a nurse. Your job is to follow protocols and take care of patients. Not to investigate procurement decisions you don't have the context to understand. He returned to his desk, dismissed her with a glance back to his charts. We're done here. Megan didn't respond. She picked up the folder from his desk, his fingers didn't move to stop her, and walked out. She pulled the door closed quietly behind her. In the elevator down, she stood alone, her hand resting against the cool metal wall, and allowed exactly 3 seconds for her jaw to clench. Then nothing. Just breath. Just the hum of machinery carrying her toward whatever came next. By noon, it was official. The schedule rotation was posted. Night shift, starting that evening. And when she tried to access the supply requisition system during her remaining daytime hours, her credentials had been revoked. She didn't call her son. She didn't complain to anyone. She simply went home, slept for hours, and reported back at 10:58 p.m. for her first graveyard shift. The ICU at midnight was a different world, half the staff, half the supervision, half the interference. The attending physician that night was Dr. Patel, who had worked at St. Michael's for 14 years and had the kind of quiet competence that came from having seen everything twice. The residents were fresh, 2 of them, barely 30 days into their rotations, still moving with the uncertainty of people in over their heads. And there was one nurse, besides Megan, who had pulled nights for the last 7 years, Marcus Chen, a man in his 50s with forearms like cordwood and the ability to start and fall in a moving helicopter if necessary. She worked methodically through the shift. Patient monitoring. Medication administration. Documentation. Everything by the book, everything quiet. She noticed things, small things. A new shipment of equipment had arrived that afternoon, expensive items that corresponded to no visible clinical need. Defibrillators in quantities that exceeded the hospital's bed count. Supplies stacked in the storage closet with vendor stickers that matched Caldwell's inflated orders. At 2:13 a.m., Marcus pulled her aside while the residents were reviewing orders at the central station. "You need to stop," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper, his massive frame blocking her from view of the hallway. "Stop what?" "Asking questions. Looking at the numbers. Noticing things you're not supposed to notice." He glanced over his shoulder, then back to her. "Caldwell made some calls today. Talked to the board members. Said you're a liability. Unstable. Making accusations without evidence. He told everyone not to take anything you say seriously. That you've got some kind of savior complex and you're going to cause problems." Megan didn't move. The hallway was quiet except for the distant beeping of monitors and the whisper of the ventilation system. "He's wrong," Marcus continued. His expression was complicated, sympathetic but also frightened. "But you can't fight that. Not here. Not alone. He has connections. People owe him favors. Just drop it. Do your job. Forget about the supplies. Please." "Thank you for telling me," Megan said. "That's not a yes." "No," she said quietly. "It's not." Marcus exhaled, shook his head, and walked away. She watched him return to the central station, his shoulders tense. She understood what he had done, the calculation he had made. He had a family. He had a pension. He couldn't afford to make enemies of administrators. His kindness in warning her was itself an act of courage, and she would not repay it by asking him to commit professional suicide. She documented everything else she observed that night. The supply anomalies. The equipment arrivals that made no clinical sense. The vendor names that corresponded to names in Caldwell's phone directory. She had glanced at it once when he was in the bathroom, her memory trained by 20 years of operational briefings to absorb and retain details in seconds. All of it went into a small notebook, written in her precise print, dates and times and specifics. By 4:19 a.m., 3 patients had been admitted to the ICU. A post-operative cardiac bypass patient, a pneumonia case with septic indicators, and a trauma admission, a construction accident, a man named Davis with a crush injury to his chest. Megan had helped get him stabilized, had assisted with the chest films, had monitored his O2 saturation as it climbed back toward acceptable range. She was sitting at the nurse's station reviewing his chart when Dr. Patel approached with a cup of coffee he had clearly made himself, hospital coffee, the kind that tastes like a warning. "You're doing good work," he said quietly, setting the cup beside her keyboard. She looked at him. "I won't ask about the supplies. And you shouldn't either. Not yet. But I see what you're seeing." He paused. "There are people who notice things. Who remember things. When the time comes, if the time comes, those people will matter." He walked away before she could respond. She sat there with the coffee cooling beside her, Marcus's warning in one ear and Patel's cryptic acknowledgement in the other, and made a decision. She would keep working. Keep documenting. Keep her head down and her hand steady and her mouth shut. And she would wait. 3 more nights of graveyard shift. 3 more nights of watching the supply inconsistencies multiply, watching Caldwell avoid the ICU entirely now that she was there, watching the hospital's infrastructure hum along with its small corruptions intact and invisible. She touched the challenge coin in her pocket once, at 3:22 a.m. on the 3rd night, during a quiet moment. The tarnished silver was worn smooth from 20 years of carrying it. Proof. That's all it was. Proof that she had been someone else. That she had held lives in her hands in the dark. That she had been trained for something far larger than this. But that wasn't the only thing worth noticing. On her 5th night of graveyard shifts, at 2:38 a.m., Davis, the construction worker with the crush injury, was stabilized enough to be moved out of the ICU to a regular bed. As the transport team wheeled him past the nurse's station, his eyes found Megan's across the distance. For just a moment, something flickered in his expression. Recognition, maybe. Or just the morphine playing tricks. His eyelids drooped, and he was gone. She didn't think about it. She couldn't afford to think about it. But somewhere in the quiet of that hospital, something was about to break open. The monitor screamed at 2:06 a.m. Megan was charting in the corner station when the alarm cut through the quiet, a shrill wail that meant ventricular fibrillation, which meant death was already moving fast. She didn't look up at first. Just felt the shift in air pressure as nurses pivoted toward bed 4, where Davis, the post-op special forces patient, was supposed to be sleeping off his routine thoracic surgery. Then she saw the blood. It painted the monitor in arterial sprays, droplets that looked black under the fluorescent lights. His chest wound wasn't closed anymore. It was open. Really open. The surgical dressing had separated and something catastrophic was happening beneath, something that didn't belong in the visible world. The resident on call, Dr. Patterson, fresh out of med school, all trembling hands and deer-in-headlights panic, stood frozen in the doorway like someone had unplugged his motor functions. "We need a surgeon now," Patterson whispered. The room went dead silent except for the monitor shrieking its electronic howl. The charge nurse was already calling for backup. One of the techs had his phone out. Nobody moved toward the bed. Nobody did what needed doing in the next 45 seconds. Megan was there before she decided to move. She didn't announce herself. Didn't say excuse me or wait for permission. Her hands were already moving to the sterile field, already reaching for the 18-gauge needle she knew was in the crash cart drawer, the one Patterson wouldn't think to grab for another 30 seconds. The patient's BP was undetectable now. Not 40 over something. Not 60. Undetectable. That meant his heart was beating against nothing, a fist pumping air, and the clock was counting down in seconds. Blood loss this rate, she said quietly, not to Patterson but to herself, to the patient, to the muscle memory that lived in her hands from 20 years ago in Ramadi when she was something other than a nurse. For minutes until total exsanguination. She didn't use the word exsanguination. She said, "We crack it now or he's dead." Patterson's eyes went wider. "What? No, we can't, that's not, we need to wait for." Megan was already positioning the patient supine, already visualizing the anatomy beneath the blood-soaked surgical site. The sternum. The ribs. The pericardial sac wrapped around a heart she was about to hold in her hands. Direct cardiac massage. Field medicine. Combat medicine. The kind of procedure they taught you when a patient was already dead and the only thing between them and nothing was the willingness to violate everything a civilian hospital was supposed to be. She didn't ask for consent. It wasn't a request. She was moving on her own authority now, the voice that came out of her mouth having dropped an octave, sounding like something carved from stone. "Get me a thoracotomy tray. Now." A nurse scrambled. Patterson was still frozen, so Megan spoke directly to him, the kind of command that didn't allow for discussion. "Hold his arm. Keep him stable." His hands shook as he moved into position. Megan's did not. She could feel every person in the ICU watching. Could feel them trying to understand how a night shift nurse who asked questions about supply orders had just activated a level of authority that didn't belong to her. But there was no time for explanations. There was barely time for breathing. Her fingers found the intercostal space, the fourth rib, right side, where she needed to be. The anatomical landmarks moved through her mind like a map she'd walked 1,000 times. She had the scalpel in her hand before anyone could tell her to stop. The blade moved with the terrible fluid precision of someone who had done this before, who had muscle memory that ran deeper than job titles and civilian credentials. The thoracotomy knife cut through skin and muscle with a sound like tearing leather. Blood welled up immediately. The resident made a small noise of protest that she didn't acknowledge. "Keep the field clear," she said. She cracked his ribs with her bare hands. There was no other way to say it. Her palms pressed against his rib cage and she applied force the way a person would crack open a door that wouldn't yield to anything else. The sound was surgical and terrible, a breaking that was also a saving, a violation that was also a resurrection. The pericardium opened and she was inside. His heart was a fist of failing muscle, beating weak and panicked against nothing. She didn't hesitate. Her hands, the same hands that had held a 6-year-old boy's chest while mortars rained down on Ramadi, the same hands that had breathed life into lungs that had stopped working, wrapped around that failing heart and began the massage. Compression. Firm, she said, and her voice carried the weight of someone who had trained for this in the dark, who had practiced on mannequins made of plastic that felt nothing like flesh, but had also practiced on flesh because war was the most brutal training program ever invented. 1, 2, 3. Her hands moved with mechanical certainty, squeezing the organ, forcing blood through chambers that had forgotten how to remember their own rhythm. Every compression was deliberate. Every movement was calibrated to keep a man alive, to keep a heart beating through sheer force of will translated into physical action. "Epi running?" she asked. "Pushing 1.5 milligrams," a nurse answered, her voice small but present. Megan counted beats in her head. O2 sat climbing on the monitor. 58. She kept compressing. 62. The color was still wrong, still the gray-blue of hypoxia, still the color of dying, but it was climbing. 65. 72. She was forcing the blood to go where it needed to go, forcing the lungs to exchange gas, forcing the body to remember how to be alive. For minutes. That's how long she held his heart in her hands. For minutes that felt like breathing underwater, like time had become a tangible thing she could push against. Her forearms were covered in blood up to the elbows. Her face probably had spray on it. She didn't notice. There was only the heart. Only the rhythm. Only the numbers climbing. 78. 81. 88. "We have sinus rhythm," the tech said, her voice cracking slightly as she read the monitor. Megan kept compressing. One more beat. Two more. She wasn't stopping until she was certain. Until the heart remembered on its own how to do what hearts were meant to do. The monitor showed a pattern now, a real pattern, not the fibrillation chaos from moments ago. The electrical activity was organizing itself. Normalizing. Becoming the signature of a man who wanted to keep living. 92. Stable. She stepped back from the bed, her hands dropping to her sides, and the room seemed to refill with sound and light and all the things her focus had filtered out. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm. The monitor beeped its steady pulse. Patterson was staring at her with an expression that suggested someone had just rewired his understanding of what a nurse could be. "Call surgery," Megan said, her voice level. "Tell them we need full cardiac team. He needs a sternum repair and we need to know what else is compromised." Patterson nodded. He was already moving toward the phone, already doing what she had told him to do without question. The charge nurse was giving her a look that could have cracked glass. One of the techs was staring at her hands, at the blood on her hands, at the way her fingers had gone still, at the absence of tremor in someone who had just cracked open a human chest. She didn't explain herself. Didn't offer apologies or excuses or the kind of deferential language that usually poured out of her mouth around this hospital. She turned toward the supply area instead, toward the sink where she could wash the blood off, where she could disappear into the routine of cleaning up a crisis and pretending she was just a nurse who had happened to be in the right place. But that wasn't what she was, and somewhere in the back of the ICU, someone was starting to wonder. Dr. Caldwell appeared in the ICU doorway at 2:06 a.m., his face flushed with the peculiar energy of a man who had just received 3 frantic phone calls from board members asking him to fix something that wasn't broken. He stopped cold when he saw her. Megan stood at the patient's bedside, both hands deep in the open thoracic cavity, her forearms slick with blood, performing direct cardiac massage on the Special Forces operator who had been flatlined for minutes ago. The monitor sang its steady mechanical rhythm now. Sinus rhythm. Perfusing beat. The kind of rhythm that meant life instead of a body bag. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. Not with anger. With calculation. His jaw worked silently as he watched her withdraw her hands, as he watched her reach for sterile gauze, as he watched the attending physician, the one who had frozen in the doorway while this nurse did his job, begin to write the admission note that should have contained his name as the hero. Caldwell saw only one thing in that moment: opportunity. A nurse. Acting outside her scope. Performing a procedure she had no legal authority to perform. One that worked. One that would be impossible to explain if framed correctly. He turned and walked back out into the hallway. The next voice anyone heard from him came at 3:15 a.m., when he called the first board member from his office, his tone controlled and measured, painting a picture of institutional liability. A nurse. No physician's order. No protocols followed. A reckless decision that happened to succeed but could have cost them accreditation. Could have cost them millions. The second call came at 3:34 a.m. Then the third. By 4:22 a.m., the complaint was typed and filed. Outside her scope of practice. Gross negligence. Endangerment of a patient. Every word crafted to look clinical. Every word designed to destroy. Security arrived at 11:22 a.m. 2 officers in crisp uniforms, their radios crackling with a dead frequency of routine. Megan didn't argue. Didn't ask for a lawyer. Didn't demand to see the charges. She simply walked to her locker in the break room, pulled out her personal items, a change of clothes, a water bottle, a photograph of her son, and held out her hospital badge. The security guard took it, his face apologetic. The kind of apology men give when they know they're following orders but wish they weren't. It wasn't a request, Caldwell had told him. It was a command. The words had come through the phone like a wire strung tight. Megan cleared her locker in 90 seconds. Everything except one object, which she had removed weeks ago and kept in her scrub pocket. The tarnished challenge coin. It went into her jacket. The rest went into a cardboard box that one of the nurses, Sarah, the one who had warned her about Caldwell's board connections, tried to help her carry out, tears in her eyes. Megan shook her head. "Just go back," she said quietly. "If you're seen with me right now, it complicates things." Sarah's hands dropped to her sides. Megan walked toward the exit alone. She didn't see Davis. The Special Forces operator was somewhere in post-op recovery, his chest wound, sutured and dressed, his body still riding the chemical tide of morphine and anesthesia. But in the moment between sleeping and waking, between the fog and the clarity, his eyes opened. He was reaching for the call button when he heard the commotion in the hallway. Voices. One of them was hers. Not the words, he couldn't make out the words through the sedation and the wall between rooms, but the cadence. The specific pattern of breath and silence that belonged to one person and one person only. The moment before his eyes closed again, he saw her pass the window of his room. Being led out by security. Being escorted away like a prisoner. Recognition flickered across his morphine-dulled face like lightning in fog. Those hands. Steady hands compressing a child's chest in the smoke and blood of a bombed marketplace in Ramadi. Hands that had saved him twice, once as a boy, once as a man. Eyes like the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. The nurse. The one who had disappeared. By 3 a.m., Megan sat alone in Tommy's diner on the edge of Savannah, in a booth with cracked vinyl seats and a window that overlooked the rain-soaked parking lot. The coffee in her cup had gone cold an hour ago. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark glass, a woman in a hospital parking attendant's jacket she'd changed into, her hair pulled back, her face emptied of everything except exhaustion. The rain hammered the windows in sheets. Wind shook the glass. A stranger had offered her an umbrella outside the hospital. She had declined. She had walked through the rain as if it didn't dare touch her, though it did, drenching her scrubs, plastering her hair against her temples, seeping into her boots. 20 years ago, rain in Ramadi had tasted like copper and diesel fuel. This rain tasted like failure. She opened her palm and stared at the challenge coin. The edges were worn smooth from 20 years of being held exactly like this, fingers curved around it like a prayer, thumb running across the embossed insignia. The only proof. The only evidence that Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien had ever existed outside of a sealed file in the Pentagon. Everything else had been erased. Orders from the highest levels. The operation in Ramadi had been classified so thoroughly that even the hospital records showed no name, no soldier extracted, no 6-year-old boy with a collapsed lung and morphine-dulled eyes looking up at her with recognition. All of it gone. Officially erased. She had been told never to surface. Never to claim what she had done. Never to speak the name of the unit or the names of the men who had carried her out or the protocols she had broken to save a child who was never supposed to be saved in the first place. The brass had made that clear, stay invisible or lose your son. The threat had been delivered so smoothly it barely registered as a threat at all. Just policy. Just how things worked when the black budgets were involved. The coin trembled in her grip. Not from fear. From something worse. From the knowledge that they might have been right all along. That keeping the secret had poisoned everything. That Caldwell had seen something in her and decided to crush it, and maybe he had been correct to do so. Maybe she was dangerous. Maybe she was reckless. Maybe the best thing she could do for her son was to disappear completely. To throw the coin into the parking lot and walk away from every version of herself and start over as someone nobody had ever heard of. She raised her hand. The coin sat in her open palm, the weight of 2 decades pressing down like gravity. The sound came from the edge of the parking lot. Not loud. Distant. The distinctive pulse of helicopter rotors cutting through rain and wind. Then 2 more, forming a pattern that meant military transport. Megan's hand stopped mid-motion. She didn't move. Didn't turn toward the window. But her thumb pressed against the coin and held it down, her fingers closing around it again, and somewhere in that moment between doubt and decision, she chose to believe that this wasn't over. The helicopters grew louder. The sound filled the diner, a thrumming percussion that made the coffee cups rattle in their saucers. Megan kept her eyes on her reflection in the window, watching the woman there slowly straighten her spine, slowly release the breath she had been holding, slowly remember that soldiers didn't stay buried. Not forever. Not when the people who had been saved remembered what those hands could do. The headlights swept across the diner parking lot in a pattern that meant arrival. Boots on asphalt. The rotor wash shook the windows. And in the kitchen, the old man who had been pretending not to notice her for the past hour set down his coffee pot and quietly locked the front door from the inside. He had been a Marine once. He knew the sound of a rescue when he heard one. Her 16-year-old son walked into that hospital conference room carrying a weathered shadow box like it weighed 1,000 pounds. His hand shook as he set it down on the polished mahogany table where Dr. Caldwell sat flanked by two lawyers in charcoal suits, papers scattered between them like evidence of war. "Mom," the boy said, his voice cracking on a single word. "They need to see these." The lid opened. Inside, medals caught the fluorescent glare. A bronze star. Then a silver star, its ribbon faded from 20 years of darkness. Two purple hearts nested against blue velvet. The light hit the engraving, a Brian, M.E., and below it, a date nobody in that room could parse, a date buried so deep in classified files that even congressional oversight had forgotten it existed. Dr. Caldwell's face drained the color of old bone. The hospital administrator, a woman named Patricia Chen who had signed Megan's termination paperwork less than 18 hours ago, leaned forward. Her hand trembled as she reached toward the medals. She didn't touch them. Some instinct told her not to. From the ICU 2 floors down, they heard the elevator doors open. The wheelchair came through the conference room doors like a mobile statement. Davis, the patient Megan had cracked open and resuscitated, whose heart she had compressed with her bare hands in the dark, pushed himself forward with the upper body strength of someone who had spent the last 2 decades training to survive impossible things. Monitors still tethered him. The line swung from the pole attached to his chair. He was 48 hours post-op, still oozing into surgical drains, moving on a cocktail of morphine and pure command authority that made his physical fragility irrelevant. He struggled upright using the table for leverage. The room held its breath. One word. That was all it took. Valkyrie. The silence that followed was not quiet. Silence is passive. This was the absence of sound the way a vacuum is the absence of air, a tangible, crushing void that made ears ring. Her operational call sign. Her call sign. The one she had not heard spoken aloud in 20 years. The one that was supposed to remain buried with the bodies in Ramadi, classified deeper than national defense secrets, deeper than the names of station chiefs, buried so thoroughly that even her own son had never been told what it meant. Caldwell's lawyers exchanged glances. One of them, a younger man with an expensive watch, reached for the documents in front of him as if they might somehow protect him from what was about to happen. The security guard, a man in his 70s named Tom Halloway who had served on a destroyer tender in the 1970s, went pale. His eyes moved from Davis to the medals to the name engraved on the silver star. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He had escorted her out of this building. He had deactivated her badge. He had seen her walk out into the rain with the kind of composure that only comes from someone who has already lost everything worth losing, and he had thought, they had all thought, that she was just a nurse who had overstepped, who had been caught practicing outside her scope, who had gotten too big for her britches and been corrected. He had no idea he had just walked a Master Chief Petty Officer out of a federal building. The conference room door opened again. The man who entered wore dress blues with 2 stars on each shoulder. Brigadier General Sarah Mercer, attached to JSOC's administrative division, had received a phone call 43 minutes earlier from a very upset Special Forces Command Sergeant Major who had just realized that one of his patients, Delta Squadron, assigned to his care, had recognized the night nurse as the medic who had saved his life twice in a hot zone 2 decades ago. The general had made 3 phone calls, pulled up a file marked deleted, terminated asset, classified burial, and gotten in her car. She carried a folder. Inside it were 17 commendations, 3 combat deployment medals, a statement of service spanning 23 years, and a classification stamp so old it had been replaced twice. Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, the general said, and her voice shook like artillery fire. 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan, Iraq, and Yemen. 17 separate commendations for valor. 2 Purple Hearts. 1 Bronze Star. And 1 Silver Star for actions taken in Ramadi on March 14, 2003, when she extracted a CIA asset from a hostile zone under mortar and small arms fire. The report filed at that time indicated that you were killed in action. That was incorrect. After the operation was classified and buried, you were ordered to cease all military activity and assume a civilian identity. You were told that your service record would be erased. You were told never to surface. You complied. The general's eyes moved to Caldwell. "You are an idiot," she said. Davis gripped the table, his knuckles white, his voice rough from post-operative sedation. "That day in Ramadi. She shielded me. I was 6 years old. The marketplace exploded. Mortars everywhere. She covered my body with hers. My chest collapsed. I couldn't breathe. And his voice broke. She breathed for me. She put her hands on my ribs and forced air into my lungs until the medevac came. Then she carried me. Half a mile. Through enemy territory. Her body was bleeding. My blood was on her chest. And she never once let me fall." 10 seconds of silence. Exactly 10. Chen counted them without meaning to, watching the second hand on the wall clock move with excruciating precision. Then Caldwell stood up. His face had moved past pale into something closer to translucent. "This is insane," he said. "This is a setup. I don't know what any of you think you're." The FBI agents who entered the conference room did so with the casual precision of people who had been standing just outside the door, waiting for the exact moment to walk in. Badges clipped to suit jackets. Faces that had seen this particular brand of panic before. One of them held a tablet showing the hospital's IT logs, Caldwell's panicked attempt to access and alter Megan's personnel file at 3:27 a.m., 3 hours after she had been escorted out. The digital fingerprints were pristine. The access logs were irrefutable. The attempted destruction of federal records was federal crime number 1. What the agents had found when they pulled the full audit was worse. 23 months of inflated equipment orders. Commission payments routed through a shell company in Delaware. Invoices for ventilators that were never delivered. Surgical suites billed for in quantities that didn't exist. The network of fraud extended so far that the FBI's fraud division was already making calls to 3 other hospitals in the state. Dr. Marcus Caldwell, the agent with a tablet, said, "You're under arrest for federal fraud, falsification of records, and attempted destruction of classified military documentation." The handcuffs made a particular sound, a metallic click, then the ratcheting lock of the second cuff closing around the wrist. Caldwell's lawyers were already standing, already backing away, already calculating their own legal exposure. The general looked at Megan directly for the first time since entering the room. A nod. Just that. A single dip of her chin, and in it was an entire conversation, permission. Recognition. Welcome home. Megan did not move from where she had been standing in the doorway. She had not made a sound since her son entered the conference room. Her hands hung at her sides, steady as surgical lasers. Her eyes had watched every reaction, Davis's recognition, Caldwell's disintegration, the general's controlled fury. She watched the federal agents place Caldwell into handcuffs and lead him out of the room, his lawyer's voice rising and falling like background noise, meaningless as wind. Chen, the hospital administrator, cleared her throat. "Ms. O'Brien, we need to discuss your reinstatement and—" "I need to check on my patient," Megan said. Her voice dropped an octave, stripped of the careful deference she had maintained for the last 3 years. Not a request. A statement of fact. His 48 hours post-op and currently unsupervised. She turned and walked out of the conference room without waiting for approval. 6 months later, the medical supply scandal had consumed the entire Savannah healthcare network. The FBI had traced kickback schemes across 4 hospitals and 2 adjacent counties. Dr. Caldwell was awaiting trial with a bail amount he couldn't meet. His medical license had been suspended pending criminal proceedings. And in a strip mall off Victory Drive, where the paint was peeling and the neon sign buzzed like dying insects, he stood behind a folding table selling supplemental insurance policies to people who had no reason to believe him, who looked at his name tag, Steve, now just Steve, and saw a broken man whose hand shook slightly when customers asked about coverage options. Nobody called him doctor anymore. At St. Michael's Hospital, in the renovated ICU that now bore a plaque reading O'Brien Emergency Services Wing, Megan stood at a patient's bedside checking vitals. A new admit, post-op cardiac, still foggy from anesthesia. She adjusted the flow rate with the kind of economy of motion that spoke to 2 decades of doing this in places where efficiency meant lives saved. Her scrubs were blue. Her badge read, Director of Emergency Services, Trauma Medicine. On her desk in the administrative office 1 floor down, the tarnished military challenge coin sat next to her computer, finely polished. The morning light through the window caught it at exactly 6:38 a.m., the same time it caught it every day, turning it into a small brass sun. It was no longer the only proof that she had existed. But she kept it anyway. Her son brought her coffee at shift change. Black, no sugar. She accepted it without comment, their shared understanding wordless and complete. Davis had been discharged 3 weeks ago. He sent a photo, him in full military dress, his 6-year-old daughter on his shoulders, both of them grinning at the camera. On the back, written in careful print, she saved me twice. Once in Ramadi. Once in Savannah. I'll never forget either time. Megan pinned the photo next to the window where the light could find it. A young resident, new to the department, fresh out of fellowship, asked her about a case during rounds. Megan answered with precision, walked him through the decision tree, asked him what he would do differently. When he responded correctly, she nodded once. It was the smallest gesture. The resident had no way of knowing that it meant, you're going to be good at this. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind that comes from understanding exactly how much power you're holding and choosing, every single day, to hold it in check. To use it only when lives depend on it. To be just a nurse, when you could have been so much more. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. Subscribe for more stories of the ones they couldn't silence. Like this video if you would have done the same thing. And in the comments, tell me. What would you have done in Megan's shoes? Would you have stayed quiet? Or would you have pushed back?